If you fall from 22,000 feet without a parachute, you will die. This isn't a debate. This isn't a maybe. This isn't a philosophical question about fate or divine intervention. It's physics. Cold, mathematical, absolute physics. Your body accelerates the first 12 seconds until air resistance equals the force of gravity pulling you down. You hit 120 miles per hour. That's what scientists call terminal velocity, the maximum speed a falling human body can achieve. At that speed, when you hit the ground, the deceleration happens in roughly 1/100th of a second. Your bones don't just break, they shatter into fragments. Your organs don't just rupture, they liquefy from the sudden compression. Your skull doesn't crack. It explodes like an egg dropped from a building. The force is equivalent to 50 times your body weight concentrated into a fraction of a heartbeat. The survival rate for a fall from terminal velocity onto a hard surface is 0. Not nearly 0. Not extremely rare. 0. It has never happened. It cannot happen. The human body is not designed to withstand that kind of instantaneous deceleration. Throughout all of human history, thousands of people have fallen from great heights. Skydivers whose parachutes failed, construction workers who lost their grip, pilots ejected from damaged aircraft, mountain climbers who slipped, window washers whose harnesses broke, and every single one of them who hit solid ground at terminal velocity died. Every single one. This is a law. This is reality. This is the contract we make with gravity the moment we're born. But on January 3rd, 1943, at exactly 11:24 a.m., a 23-year-old ball turret gunner named Alan Magee fell 22,000 feet, more than 4 miles, from a burning B-17 bomber over Nazi-occupied France. He had no parachute. The centrifugal force from a spinning aircraft had thrown him clear of the wreckage. He was unconscious, bleeding from 28 shrapnel wounds, his right lung punctured, his face torn apart by jagged metal, and he was falling at 120 miles per hour toward the concrete and cobblestone streets of the French coastal town of Saint-Nazaire. He crashed through the glass roof of the Saint-Nazaire railway station at terminal velocity. The glass exploded. The iron framework buckled. His body tumbled through the shattered skylight and struck a network of steel girders 25 feet below. And when German soldiers stationed in the building climbed up to retrieve what they assumed would be a corpse, they found Alan Magee draped across the beams, breathing, his heart beating, his brain firing, alive. This is the story of the most statistically impossible survival in military history. The story of how a 155-pound man defied the laws of physics. The story of how a single glass roof rewrote what we thought we knew about death. And the story of how one German doctor chose humanity over war and saved a man who should have been nothing more than a crater in the ground. But before we can understand how Alan Magee survived, we need to understand who he was. We need to understand what it meant to be a ball turret gunner in 1943. We need to understand what it felt like to sit in the most dangerous, claustrophobic, exposed position on a B-17 bomber, a plexiglass sphere hanging beneath the belly of the aircraft, surrounded by nothing but thin glass and the cold European sky 4 miles below. We need to understand what brought him to that moment, because survival stories don't begin at the moment of crisis. They begin long before, in the decisions we make, the risks we accept, and the circumstances we cannot control. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start with a kid from New Jersey who wanted to be a pilot, a kid who was too short for the cockpit, but exactly the right size for the ball turret. A kid who would fly 7 missions over Nazi-occupied Europe before physics tried to kill him, and failed. Alan Magee was born on January 13, 1919, in Plainfield, New Jersey, a small industrial town about 30 miles southwest of New York City. He grew up in the shadow of the Great Depression. Money was tight. Opportunities were scarce. But he had dreams. He wanted to fly, not as a passenger, not as a mechanic, as a pilot. He wanted to be the one with his hands on the controls, the one making the decisions, the one commanding the aircraft. He studied aviation magazines. He built model planes. He memorized the specifications of every American fighter and bomber. He could identify aircraft by silhouette alone. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The next morning, December 8th, Alan Magee walked into an Army Air Force's recruitment office. He was 22 years old. He told the recruiter he wanted to be a pilot. They measured his height, 5 feet, 6 inches. They weighed him, 155 pounds. The recruiter looked at his paperwork, then looked at Magee and said, "You're too short for pilot training, but you're perfect for something else. The ball turret." Now, if you don't know what a ball turret is, let me paint you a picture. Imagine a glass sphere about 3.5 feet in diameter, barely wider than a refrigerator. Inside that sphere, you sit in a fetal position with your knees pulled up to your chest. Your back is curved. Your head is tilted forward. You're surrounded by two .50 caliber machine guns that stick out to the glass like insect antennae. This sphere is mounted on a rotating mechanism beneath the belly of a B-17 bomber. It hangs exposed beneath the fuselage. No armor plating. No protection. Just you, two guns, and a thin shell of plexiglass between you and the freezing air at 22,000 feet. You enter the turret through a hatch in the floor of the bomber. You fold yourself into the fetal position. The hatch closes above you, and then you're alone, dangling beneath 4 tons of aircraft, spinning in 360-degree arcs to track enemy fighters, scanning the sky below for German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that are specifically trained to attack from below, because they know the ball turret gunner is the most vulnerable crew member. And here's the thing that terrified every ball turret gunner. There's no room for a parachute inside the turret, so you leave it on the deck, on the floor of the bomb bay, 30 feet away. If the plane gets hit and starts going down, you have to rotate the turret to the exit position, climb out through the hatch, crawl through the fuselage, grab your parachute, strap it on, and then bail out. All of this while the plane is on fire, while it's spinning, while your crewmates are screaming, while you have maybe 60 seconds before the aircraft explodes or breaks apart. Ball turret gunners had the highest casualty rate in the 8th Air Force. German fighter pilots knew this. They targeted the ball turret first. A quick burst of machine gun fire into that plexiglass sphere, and the gunner was dead. No escape, no ejection seat, no second chance. By January 1943, Alan Magee had completed 6 combat missions. He'd seen bombers go down. He'd watched parachutes bloom in the sky, white flowers against a gray European winter. He'd seen planes explode in midair, disintegrating into falling debris and bodies. He'd watched friends die, but he kept climbing into that turret, because that was the job, because there was a war to win, because his crewmates depended on him to protect the belly of the aircraft, and because in some strange way, he'd made peace with the risk. On the morning of January 3rd, 1943, Magee suited up like always. Heavy flight jacket, fleece-lined pants, leather gloves, oxygen mask, helmet. He checked his guns. He checked his ammunition. He climbed aboard the B-17 nicknamed Snap. Crackle. Pop. A cheerful, almost absurd name for a machine designed to drop high-explosive bombs on German targets. It was his 7th mission. A daylight bombing raid. High risk. Maximum exposure. The target, St. Nazaire, France. The bomber crews had another name for St. Nazaire. They called it Flak City, and if you were flying into Flak City on a clear January morning, you knew that not everyone was coming home. Alan Magee folded himself into the ball turret. The hatch closed above him. The bomber's engines roared to life. And as Snap, Crackle, Pop lifted off the runway at Molesworth Air Base in England, Magee had no idea that in exactly 5 hours, he would be falling through the sky at 120 miles per hour with no parachute, and that he would survive. January 3rd, 1943, 4:30 a.m., RAF Molesworth, England. The wake-up call came in darkness. Flashlights sweeping through the barracks. A sergeant barking names. Briefing at 0500. Full combat load. Move. Alan Magee and his crewmates stumbled out of their bunks into the freezing English winter. No one spoke. You didn't waste energy on conversation. Before a mission, you saved it for staying alive. They dressed in layers. Thermal underwear. wool shirts, fleece-lined flight suits. At 22,000 feet, the temperature drops to 40 degrees below zero. The cold isn't just uncomfortable, it's lethal. Frostbite can set in within minutes. Exposed skin freezes to metal. Your breath crystallizes in your oxygen mask. At 5 a.m., they filed into the briefing room, a Quonset hut with wooden benches, a coal stove in the corner, and cigarette smoke so thick you could barely see the front wall. An intelligence officer stood beside a large map of Europe covered by a curtain. The room went silent. The officer pulled the curtain back. A collective groan. A few muttered curses. The red string stretched from England across the English Channel, deep into occupied France. It ended at a coastal town on the Atlantic, St. Nazaire. Someone in the back said, "Flak City?" The officer nodded. "Flak City?" St. Nazaire wasn't just another target. It was one of the most heavily defended locations in all of Nazi-occupied Europe. The Germans had built massive concrete submarine pens there. 16 feet of reinforced concrete designed to withstand direct hits from the heaviest bombs the Allies could drop. From those pens, German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, hunting Allied convoys. They were sinking merchant ships faster than the Allies could build them. Thousands of tons of supplies, food, ammunition, fuel, weapons, vanishing beneath the waves every month. The U-boats were strangling the Allied war effort, and St. Nazaire was the heart of the operation. The briefing officer tapped the map. Your target is a torpedo storage depot adjacent to submarine pens. Destroy the torpedoes, and you cripple the U-boat fleet. Secondary targets include the rail yards and the harbor infrastructure. He paused. Expect heavy resistance. Intelligence estimates over 400 anti-aircraft guns defending the target area. 88mm flak cannons. 20mm rapid-fire guns. They've got overlapping fields of fire. There's no safe approach. The officer looked at the faces staring back at him. Young men, most of them under 25, try and control their fear. The 8th Air Force is committing 169 B-17s to this mission. The 303rd Bomb Group will lead the strike. Wheels up at 0612. Formation assembly over the channel. Estimated time over target, 1,120 hours. Expected return, 1,430 hours. He didn't say the other part. The part everyone already knew. The part that hung in the air like the cigarette smoke. Not all of you will come back. At 6:12 a.m., snap, crackle, pop, lifted off the runway. The engines, for massive right cyclones, screamed at full throttle. The wheels left the ground. And Alan Magee, already folded into his ball turret, felt a familiar lurch as the bomber climbed into gray English sky. One by one, the B-17s took off. They circled above the airfield, forming up into tight combat boxes, groups of 3, staggered in altitude, wingtips nearly touching. The formation was defensive. The overlapping fields of fire from dozens of machine guns created a protective bubble. German fighters that tried to penetrate the formation would be cut to pieces. At least, that was the theory. At 9:30 a.m., the formation crossed the English Channel. Below, the cold gray water stretched to the horizon. Magee rotated his turret, scanning for enemy fighters. Nothing yet, just sky and clouds in the distant coast of France. At 10:45 a.m., they crossed into occupied airspace. At 11 a.m., the first flak appeared. Black puffs materialized ahead of them, small dark smudges against the blue sky. Then more, then dozens. The German gunners on the ground had radar. They knew exactly where the bombers were, and they were filling the sky with steel. Each flak shell was timed to explode at a specific altitude. When it detonated, it sent 1,500 pieces of jagged shrapnel radiating outward in a lethal cloud. Each piece traveled at 3,000 feet per second, fast enough to punch through aluminum like paper, fast enough to sever a wing, fast enough to ignite fuel tanks, fast enough to kill. Magee watched a B-17 200 yards to his left take a direct hit. The right wing crumpled. The bomber rolled onto its back and started spinning. He counted 3 parachutes, maybe 4. Then the bomber disappeared into the clouds below. 7 men on that plane, 3 or 4 parachutes. The math was simple and brutal. At 11:22 a.m., snap, crackle, pop, reached the initial point, the start of the bomb run. For the next 90 seconds, they had to fly straight and level. No evasive maneuvers. No turning. The bombardier needed a stable platform to aim the Norden bomb site. 90 seconds of flying directly into flak. 90 seconds of being a target. The sky erupted. Flak burst surrounded them. Above, below, left, right. The concussion shook the aircraft. Shrapnel pinged off the fuselage. The smell of cordite and burning metal filled the air. At 11:22 and 37 seconds, an 88mm shell detonated 18 feet beneath snap. Crackle, pop, and Alan Magee's world exploded. The shrapnel tore through the B-17's belly at 3,000 feet per second. 1,500 pieces of jagged steel punched through aluminum, through electrical wiring, through hydraulic lines, through flesh. Alan Magee felt the impacts before he heard them. Hot metal ripping through his flight suit, through his skin, through muscle. He felt the warm wetness of blood spreading across his chest and face. He felt the sharp, immediate agony of shrapnel carving through his right eye socket, through his nose, through his right lung. He tried to scream, but couldn't catch his breath. The oxygen mask was gone, ripped away. And at 22,000 feet without oxygen, you have about 15 seconds of useful consciousness before your brain starts shutting down. The right inboard engine exploded. Flames erupted from the cowling. Thick black smoke poured back along the fuselage. Inside the cockpit, the pilot, a 24-year-old from Ohio, pulled back on the yoke with everything he had. Nothing. The control cables had been severed. The elevator wasn't responding. The rudder wasn't responding. The ailerons were frozen. Snap, crackle, pop, nosed over. And then it started spinning. Not a gentle roll. A violent, uncontrolled flat spin. The aircraft rotating around its vertical axis like a top, the nose dropping, the tail whipping around, faster and faster and faster. Inside the fuselage, chaos. Equipment tore loose from the walls. Ammunition cans tumbled through the air. Men were thrown against bulkheads. The navigator's table ripped free from its mounts. The radio operator was slammed into the ceiling, then thrown to the floor. Someone was screaming. Someone else was praying. And in the ball turret, Alan Magee became a human centrifuge. The centrifugal force pinned him against the inside of the plexiglass sphere. He couldn't move his arms. Couldn't reach the controls. Couldn't rotate the turret to the exit position. The world outside spun in a nauseating blur. Sky, ground, sky, ground, sky, ground, rotating faster and faster until he couldn't tell up from down. His vision narrowed. Tunnel vision. The edges going dark. His blood pressure plummeting as the centrifugal force pulled blood away from his brain. At 22,000 feet, with no oxygen, with shrapnel wounds bleeding, with his body pinned by G-forces, Alan Magee's brain made the only rational choice. It shut down. He lost consciousness. Elsewhere in the aircraft, other crewmen were bailing out. The pilot gave the order, "Abandon aircraft! Abandon aircraft!" The bombardier dove through the forward hatch. Parachute deployed. He'd survive. The navigator followed. Parachute deployed. He'd survive. The waist gunner jumped. Parachute deployed. He'd survive. 7 other men didn't make it. The spinning aircraft threw them against the walls. The fire spread. The fuselage started breaking apart. Some were trapped. Some were already dead from shrapnel. Some froze with fear and couldn't move. And Alan Magee? He was still in the ball turret. Still unconscious. Still spinning. His parachute was 30 feet away, on the floor of the bomb bay, utterly unreachable. At 11:23 a.m., the structural integrity of the ball turret failed. The metal mount, stressed beyond its design limits by the centrifugal force and the shrapnel damage, tore apart. The entire ball turret ripped free from the bomber. For a split second, it tumbled alongside the falling B-17. Then physics took over. The turret was heavier, less aerodynamic. It began to fall faster. It pulled away from the bomber, spinning, tumbling, plummeting toward the earth, and then the plexiglass shattered. The turret disintegrated. Alan Magee's unconscious body was thrown clear. No parachute, no harness, no safety equipment. Just a 155-pound man in a blood-soaked flight suit, falling at terminal velocity for miles above the earth. The bomber, what was left of it, continued its death spiral. It would crash 30 seconds later into Forêt de la Balle, a pine forest near Saint-Nazaire. The impact would scatter wreckage across half a mile. German soldiers would later cut out the nose section, the part with the snap, crackle, pop, artwork, and display it as a war trophy. But Alan Magee was no longer with the aircraft. He was falling alone, unconscious, tumbling, his body limp, limbs flailing, blood trailing behind in the cold air. He fell through 20,000 feet, through 15,000 feet, through 10,000 feet. His body accelerated, faster and faster until air resistance equaled gravity. 120 miles per hour. Terminal velocity. At 5,000 feet, the cold wind hit his face. His eyelids fluttered. Consciousness beginning to return. His brain struggling to process inputs. Cold, wind, pain, sky, ground, falling. At 3,000 feet, his eyes opened, blurred vision, blood in his eyes, but enough to see, to understand. He was falling. No parachute, no bomber, just him in the sky and the ground rushing up to meet him. He had about 20 seconds left to live, and there was nothing he could do about it. The German soldiers stationed inside Saint-Nazaire railway station heard the explosion of glass. They looked up and saw a man-shaped hole torn to the ceiling. Shards of glass rained down onto the platform below. Winter sunlight streamed through the opening, and draped across the steel girders, 25 feet above them, was a body. They expected a corpse. Men don't fall from the sky and live. That's not how physics works. But as they stared up at the broken body covered in blood, they saw something impossible. The chest was moving, rising, falling, rising again. He was breathing. "Mein Gott," one of them whispered. "My God." They grabbed a ladder, climbed up carefully, afraid the girders might collapse under the additional weight. When they reached him, they checked for a pulse. It was there, weak, thready, but present. Alan Magee was alive. A German medic was called. He arrived minutes later with a medical kit and a stretcher. He knelt beside Magee's broken body and began a rapid assessment. What he found should have been impossible. 28 separate shrapnel wounds from the flak hit. These weren't superficial. These were deep, penetrating wounds. Metal embedded in muscle tissue, in organs, in bone. His right arm was nearly severed at the shoulder. The bone was shattered. The major blood vessels were compromised. Only a few tendons and a thin strip of skin kept the arm attached to his body. Under normal circumstances, this alone would be a death sentence. Blood loss, shock, infection, amputation would be the only option. His right leg was broken. His ankle was fractured in multiple places. Bone fragments visible through the skin. His nose was shattered, crushed, barely recognizable as a nose anymore. His right eye was destroyed. The shrapnel had carved through the eye socket, rupturing the eyeball, destroying the optic nerve. His right lung was punctured, not collapsed, not yet, but compromised. Each breath was agony. Blood pooled in his chest cavity. His kidneys were damaged, internal bleeding, filtration compromised. Multiple ribs were fractured, at least 4, maybe 6. Each breath sent shards of pain through his chest. And yet, somehow his heart was still beating. His brain was still firing. His lungs were still pulling air, even if that air was bloody and insufficient. The medic looked at the soldiers. "We're mussin' in Salford and's Krankenhaus bringen. We need to get him to the hospital immediately." They loaded him onto the stretcher as carefully as possible. Every movement caused Magee to groan, a weak, barely human sound. They carried him out of the station, through the streets, to a German military hospital 2 kilometers away. At the hospital, a surgeon was waiting. His name was never recorded. Magee never learned it. After the war, He searched German military medical records, trying to find the man who saved his life. He found nothing, just a blank space where a hero should have been documented. The surgeon examined Magee's nearly severed arm. He called in his assistant. They spoke in rapid German. The assistant argued for amputation. Standard protocol. The bone is shattered. The tissue is destroyed. Infection is inevitable. Cut it off now while the patient is weak enough that he won't resist. But the surgeon shook his head. Nein. That's when Magee's eyes opened. Barely. Just slits. But enough to see the German officer standing over him in a military uniform. Enemy. The word registered somewhere in his fading consciousness. Enemy. The surgeon saw Magee's eyes open. He leaned closer and spoke in accented but clear English. You are alive. You are very badly hurt. But you are alive. Magee tried to speak. His lips moved. No sound came out. Just a wet, gasping attempt. The surgeon continued. I know you are my enemy. I know you came here to bomb my country. But I am a doctor first. And I will do everything in my power to save your arm. Why did he say this? Why make that promise? Maybe because he'd seen too much death already. Maybe because even in war, some men refuse to let their humanity be destroyed. Maybe because he looked at this broken 23-year-old boy and saw his own son, or his own brother, or his own younger self. We'll never know. But for the next 6 hours, that unnamed German surgeon worked to save Alan Magee's life. He reconnected tendons one by one. He stabilized the shattered bone with metal pins. He irrigated the wounds. He removed 28 pieces of shrapnel, one by one, with surgical precision. He reconstructed Magee's face as best he could. He drained the blood from Magee's chest cavity. He repaired the punctured lung. And when it was over, Alan Magee still had his arm. Broken, damaged, scarred, but attached, functional, saved. He would spend the next 3 months recovering in that hospital. And then he would be transferred to a prisoner of war camp. But he would be alive. And that German doctor, whoever he was, would be the reason why. Alan Magee woke up in a hospital bed, surrounded by enemy soldiers. His body was wrapped in bandages. His right arm was in traction, suspended by wires and pulleys, held at an unnatural angle to prevent the repaired tendons from tearing. His chest was wrapped so tightly he could barely breathe. His face was covered in gauze. Only his left eye was visible for the first few minutes. He couldn't remember where he was. His brain struggled to piece together the fragments. The flak hit, the spinning bomber, the falling, the glass, the impact, and then the memory crashed back like a tidal wave. He'd fallen 22,000 feet. He should be dead. A German nurse entered the room. She saw his open eye and approached cautiously. She checked his pulse, his temperature, his bandages. She wrote something on a clipboard. She didn't speak English, and he didn't speak German. But when she was done, she did something unexpected. She smiled at him, just a brief, almost imperceptible smile, as if to say, you survived. Against all odds, you survived. The days blurred together. Pain, morphine, sleep, fever, nightmares. He dreamed of falling every night. The same dream, over and over. Spinning sky, rushing ground, glass exploding, steel girders, impact. And then he'd wake up gasping, confused about whether he was alive or dead. The German medical staff treated him with professional detachment. They changed his bandages. They administered medication. They checked his wounds for infection. They were neither cruel nor kind, just clinical, efficient, doing their jobs. After 3 weeks, infection set in. His right arm turned red, then purple. The fever spiked to 104 degrees. He drifted in and out of consciousness, hallucinating. He saw his mother. He saw his crewmates. He saw the ball turret spinning. He saw death standing at the foot of his bed, waiting. The German surgeon returned. He examined the arm. The assistant again recommended amputation. Again, the surgeon refused. He lanced the infection, drained the pus, applied sulfanilamide powder, a new wonder drug that was saving lives on both sides of the war. He changed the dressing twice a day instead of once. And slowly, impossibly, the infection receded. By March, Magee could sit up. By April, he could stand, though his shattered leg and ankle made walking agonizing. By May, he could move his right arm. Not well, but enough to prove the tendons had reconnected. He would never have full function in that arm. The nerve damage was permanent. He'd never lift anything heavy. He'd never throw a ball. He'd never salute properly. But he had the arm. It was his. And that was more than he dared to hope for. In late April 1943, a German officer informed him that he was being transferred to a prisoner of war camp, Stalag 17B, Krems, Austria. They loaded him into the back of a truck with two other American POWs, the bombardier and navigator from SNAP. Crackle. Pop. The two who'd successfully bailed out with parachutes. They stared at Magee in silence for the first hour of the drive. Finally, the bombardier spoke. "We heard you fell. We heard you didn't have a chute." Magee nodded. "How?" the navigator asked. "How the hell are you alive?" Magee looked at his bandaged hands, at his ruined arm, at the scars that would never fade. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I hit a glass roof." The bombardier laughed, a short, bitter sound. "A glass roof. Yeah. That's it? That's the big secret? A glass roof." Magee shrugged. It hurt. Everything hurt. "That's it." The navigator shook his head. "You're the luckiest son of a bitch I've ever met." But Magee didn't feel lucky. 7 of his crewmates were dead. 7 men he'd trained with, flown with, joked with. 7 men who'd had families and dreams and futures. And they were gone. Just gone. Scattered across a French forest in pieces. And he was alive. Why him? Why not them? There was no answer. There would never be an answer. The truck drove east through occupied France, through Germany, into Austria. And when they finally arrived at Stalag 17B, a sprawling complex of barbed wire and guard towers and wooden barracks, Alan Magee became prisoner number 3869. He would spend the next 2 years behind that wire. 2 years of survival. But this time, survival wouldn't be about defying physics. It would be about enduring cold, hunger, boredom, and the slow erosion of hope. Stalag 17B, Krems, Austria. 4,000 Allied airmen imprisoned behind 20-foot-high barbed wire fences. Alan Magee arrived in late April 1943. The guards searched him, confiscated his few belongings, assigned him a barracks number, and shoved him toward Block 14. The barracks were long wooden structures with bunks stacked 3 high, thin mattresses stuffed with straw, 1 threadbare blanket per man. No heat except for a single coal stove at the center of the building, and the Germans rationed coal, so severely that the stove was only lit a few hours each day in the depths of winter. The other prisoners stared when Magee entered. Word had already spread. The man who fell from the sky. The guy who survived terminal velocity. The bald turret gunner who cheated death. Someone in the back asked, "Is it true? Did you really fall 4 miles?" Magee nodded. "Jesus Christ." Another prisoner muttered, "How?" "Glass roof," Magee said. He was tired of explaining, tired of the questions, tired of being a curiosity. He found an empty bottom bunk. Nobody wanted the bottom bunk because it was closest to the coal floor, and lay down. His arm throbbed. His leg ached. His face still hurt where the shrapnel had torn through. He closed his eyes and tried not to think about falling. Life in Stalag 17B wasn't about dramatic escape attempts or heroic defiance. Those things happened, occasionally. Tunnels were dug. Diversions were created. A few men got out. Most were caught and shot. For the majority of prisoners, survival was about something much more mundane. Rationing calories, preserving body heat, and enduring the psychological torture of endless, monotonous days. The Germans provided 1,700 calories per day, barely enough to sustain basic metabolic function, not enough to prevent slow starvation. The prisoners supplemented with Red Cross parcels when they arrived, cans of Spam, chocolate bars, cigarettes, coffee. But the parcels were irregular. Sometimes 1 per week. Sometimes nothing for a month. Men lost weight. 20 pounds. 30. 40. Their bodies consumed muscle tissue for energy. Their faces became gaunt, their ribs visible through their skin. Some developed scurvy from vitamin deficiency. Others got dysentery from contaminated water. Magee watched his own body waste away. His injured arm, already weakened by nerve damage, atrophied further from disuse. He forced himself to exercise it every day, lifting, flexing, rotating, fighting to maintain whatever function remained. Winter in Austria was brutal. Temperatures dropped below zero. The barracks weren't insulated. Ice formed on the inside of the windows. Men huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat under their thin blankets. Frostbite was common. Pneumonia killed several prisoners that first winter. But the worst part wasn't the physical hardship. It was the psychological erosion. Days blended together. Wake at dawn for roll call. Stand in the freezing yard for hours while German guards counted and recounted. Return to barracks. Eat thin soup. Sit. Wait. Sleep. Repeat. There was nothing to do. A few books circulated among the prisoners. Read so many times the pages were falling apart. Some men played cards. Some wrote letters that might or might not be delivered. Some just stared at the ceiling, retreating into their own minds. Magee dreamed of falling every night. Sometimes he woke up screaming. Sometimes he woke up silently, his heart pounding, his sheets soaked with sweat. His bunkmates learned to ignore it. "You okay?" someone asked once. "Yeah," Magee lied. The months crawled by. Summer brought relief from the cold, but new miseries. Insects, dysentery, the stench of too many unwashed men in close quarters. Then autumn, then winter again. A full year in the camp. Then another. Prisoners talked endlessly about what they'd do when the war ended, where they'd go, what they'd eat, who they'd see. It was a form of psychological survival, keeping hope alive by imagining a future. Magee didn't talk much about the future. He wasn't sure he had one. His body was broken. His mind was fractured. 7 of his crewmates were dead. He'd cheated death once, through sheer random chance, but he didn't feel like a survivor. He felt like a ghost, like he should have died with the others, and everything since was borrowed time. Spring 1945. Rumors began to circulate. The Americans were advancing from the west, the Russians from the east. Germany was collapsing. In late April, prisoners heard artillery in the distance, dull thuds that grew louder each day. The German guards became nervous. Some deserted. Others stayed at their posts, unsure what else to do. On May 7, 1945, American tanks rolled up to the gates of Stalag 17B. The guards surrendered without a fight. The gates opened, and 4,000 prisoners walked out into freedom. Alan Magee limped through those gates on a damaged leg, carrying a damaged arm, carrying 2 years of accumulated trauma. He was 26 years old. He'd survived a fall that should have killed him. He'd survived enemy surgery. He'd survived 2 years as a POW, and now he had to survive peace. For decades after Alan Magee's survival, physicists, medical researchers, and aviation safety experts studied his case. How does a human body survive a 22,000-foot fall at terminal velocity? The answer isn't simple. It's not one thing. It's a perfect storm of factors, each individually insufficient, but collectively miraculous. Let's start with the most important factor, deceleration distance. When you fall and hit a solid surface like concrete, your body stops in approximately 1/100th of a second, 0.01 seconds. That's the time it takes for your entire kinetic energy to dissipate. The force generated by that instantaneous deceleration is catastrophic. The formula is simple. Force equals mass times acceleration. Or in this case, force equals mass times deceleration. The faster you decelerate, the greater the force. And at terminal velocity, stopping in 0.01 seconds generates a force roughly 50 times your body weight concentrated into every square inch of your body simultaneously. Your bones can't withstand that. Your organs can't withstand that. Your skull can't withstand that. You die. Instantly. Every time. But Alan Magee didn't hit concrete. He hit glass. Specifically, he hit the glass roof of the St. Nazaire railway station, a structure built in the 1890s using a design common to European train stations of that era. The roof wasn't a single sheet of glass. It was hundreds of individual panes, each about 3 feet by 4 feet, held in place by an iron framework. Each pane sat in its own iron channel. The structure was designed to let in natural light while supporting snow loads in winter. When Magee's body struck that roof, something extraordinary happened. The first pane cracked. The force of impact exceeded the glass's structural limit. It shattered. The shards flew outward. And critically, that shattering absorbed kinetic energy. Not much. Maybe 5% of Magee's total energy. But some. His body continued falling. 0.01 seconds later, it hit the second pane. That pane shattered. Another 5% of kinetic energy absorbed. Third pane. Fourth pane. Fifth pane. Each one shattering in sequence. Each one absorbing a small fraction of energy. Each one slowing him down incrementally. Instead of decelerating in 0.01 seconds, Magee decelerated over approximately 0.08 seconds, 8 times longer. And because force is inversely proportional to time, that meant the force on his body was roughly 1/8 what it would have been on concrete. That's still an enormous force. Still enough to break bones, rupture organs, destroy tissue. But it's not instantly lethal. It's survivable. Barely, but survivable. Then there's the second factor, body position. Magee didn't land feet first or head first. He didn't land flat on his back or flat on his stomach. His unconscious body, limp and tumbling, struck the steel girders inside the station in a draped position, his torso folded over one beam, his legs wrapped around another, his arms hung loose. This distributed the impact force across multiple contact points. Instead of all the force concentrating in his legs or his spine or his skull, it spread across several square feet of body surface. That distribution reduced the peak force on any single bone or organ. If he'd landed differently, say, feet first, all the force would have concentrated in his legs and spine. His femurs would have been driven up through his pelvis. His spine would have compressed like an accordion. His internal organs would have liquefied from the sudden compression. He would have died instantly. But unconscious bodies don't land in control positions. They land randomly. And random chance gave him a survivable orientation. Now the third factor, muscular relaxation. When conscious people fall, they instinctively tense their muscles. It's a protective reflex. But tense muscles make your body rigid, and rigid structures shatter on impact. It's the same reason why a stiff tree branch snaps while a flexible branch bends. Unconscious bodies are completely limp. Joints flex freely. Muscles don't resist. And this flexibility allows the body to absorb impact forces more effectively. Bones can shift slightly. Joints can dislocate instead of fracturing. Organs can move within the body cavity instead of rupturing. This phenomenon has been documented in other extreme survival cases. Drunk drivers who crash at high speed often survive injuries that would kill sober drivers, not because alcohol protects them, but because they're too intoxicated to tense up before impact. Their limp bodies absorb the crash forces more effectively. Alan Magee was unconscious when he hit. His body was completely relaxed, and that relaxation saved him. So let's add it all up. Sequential glass breakage, extending deceleration time by a factor of 8. Distributed body position, spreading force across multiple contact points. Muscular relaxation, allowing flexible absorption of impact forces. And one more factor. Hitting a 4,000 square foot target in a 14 square mile town, odds of roughly 1 in 11,000. Multiply those probabilities together, and the odds of survival are approximately 1 in 55 million. For context, your odds of being struck by lightning in your lifetime are about 1 in 15,000. Your odds of winning the Powerball jackpot are 1 in 300 million. Alan Magee's survival falls right in the middle. Impossibly rare, but not quite impossible. And yet, here's the thing. Odds are just numbers. They describe probability, not destiny. Somewhere in that 55 million to 1 chance, one man's trajectory aligned perfectly with one glass roof at one specific moment. Physics bent just enough, but it didn't break. One man fell 4 miles from the sky and lived. And 52 years later, on a cold January morning in 1995, Alan Magee, now 74 years old, gray-haired, scarred, but alive, returned to St. Nazaire to stand beneath that glass roof one more time. What do you say to the glass that saved your life? He never found the words. He just stood there, looking up, tears in his eyes, and whispered, "Thank you." May 1945. Alan Magee stepped off a troop transport ship in New York Harbor. The war in Europe was over. He was home. The crowds at the pier were jubilant. Families reunited. Soldiers kissed girlfriends and wives. Children ran to fathers they barely remembered. Bands played. Confetti fell. Victory. But Magee stood on the deck watching the celebration, feeling nothing. Or rather, feeling too much. Grief. Guilt. Confusion. Relief. Numbness. He was one of the lucky ones. He'd survived. But 7 of his crewmates hadn't. Why him? Why not them? There was no good answer. Just the arbitrary cruelty of physics and probability. He spent 6 months in veterans' hospitals. Physical therapy for his arm and leg. Surgery to remove embedded shrapnel fragments that had worked their way to the surface. Psychological evaluation for what they didn't yet call PTSD, but what everyone recognized as shell shock or combat fatigue. The nightmares continued. Falling. Always falling. Some nights he woke up screaming. Some nights he just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for dawn. But slowly, painfully, he began to rebuild. He met a woman named Helen. She was a nurse at the VA hospital. She'd seen hundreds of broken soldiers. She understood trauma in a way most people didn't. They talked, then they dated, then they married. He found work in the aviation industry, the very industry that had nearly killed him. He started as a mechanic, working on civilian aircraft. The irony wasn't lost on him, but there was something therapeutic about it, about understanding the machines, about maintaining them, about making them safe. And then, in 1948, he did something extraordinary. He earned his pilot's license. The man who'd fallen 22,000 feet without a parachute chose to fly again, not as a gunner, not as a passenger, as a pilot, in control. His wife thought he was crazy. His doctors advised against it. His friends couldn't understand. But Magee was adamant. "I need to prove to myself that I'm not afraid," he told Helen. "I can't let that one day define the rest of my life." His first solo flight was terrifying. His hands shook on the controls. His heart raced. At altitude, the old panic tried to resurface, but he breathed through it. He focused on the instruments, on the horizon, on the simple mechanics of flight. And when he landed, wheels touching down smoothly on the runway, he felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years. Peace. He worked in aviation for the next 31 years. Various roles, various airlines, eventually retiring in 1979 at age 60. Every day, he worked around the machines that had almost killed him. Every day, he chose not to be afraid. But he never forgot. In 1993, 50 years to the day after his fall, Magee and his wife traveled to St. Nazaire. The town had invited him for a memorial dedication. The French people had erected a monument to the crew of Snap. Crackle, pop, all 10 men. 7 names for the dead, 3 for the survivors. They located the crash site in the Forêt de la Balle and placed a stone marker there. On January 3rd, 1993, Magee stood before that memorial with French officials, American veterans, and dozens of townspeople. The mayor of St. Nazaire declared all 10 crew members citizens of honor. Magee saluted the 7 names of the dead. His hand, the hand on his nearly severed arm, the hand that still didn't quite work right, rose slowly to his forehead. Military precision. 50 years later. And then he broke down, just stood there, weeping in front of everyone, for his crewmates, for the randomness of survival, for the guilt he'd carried for 5 decades. Helen held him, let him cry, let him grieve. The next day, they visited the American cemetery in Normandy. Row after row of white crosses stretching to the horizon. He found the graves of his crewmates, knelt beside each one, traced their names with his scarred fingers. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry I lived and you didn't. I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry. On the third day of the trip, he returned to the train station. It had been rebuilt and modernized. The glass roof was new, different design, different materials. But standing beneath it, Magee looked up and remembered the spinning, the falling, the terror, the glass exploding, the steel girders, the pain, the impossible survival. A station worker asked if he was okay. Yes, Magee said, I'm just remembering. Remembering what, monsieur? Magee pointed up at the glass roof. That saved my life 50 years ago. The worker looked confused. Then understanding dawned. You're the American? The one who fell. Yes. The worker shook his head in amazement. Say a miracle. Yes, Magee thought. It was a miracle. An impossible, inexplicable, 1 in 55 million miracle. But miracles have costs. 7 men died. 1 lived. And the survivor spent the rest of his life wondering why. Alan Magee returned to his home in New Mexico. He lived quietly for another decade, gardening, reading, spending time with his grandchildren, living the ordinary life he'd been given as a gift. On December 20th, 2003, at age 84, Alan Eugene Magee died of natural causes, stroke and kidney failure. He was cremated. His ashes were buried in Texas. He lived 61 years after a fall that should have killed him instantly. 61 years of borrowed time. 61 years of marriage, family, work, sunsets, laughter, pain, joy, and ordinary Tuesdays. All because glass broke in the right sequence. And one German doctor chose mercy over war. We began with a law. If you fall from 22,000 feet without a parachute, you will die. This law is not negotiable. It's not a guideline. It's physics. For all of human history, it has been true. Thousands have fallen. Thousands have died. The equation is simple and absolute. But on January 3rd, 1943, Alan Magee broke that law. Not through superhuman strength. He was unconscious. Not through divine intervention alone, though he believed God played a role. Not through advanced technology. The glass roof that saved him was 50 years old. He survived through an impossible convergence of factors. Physics, probability, body position, muscular relaxation, sequential energy absorption, and human compassion from an enemy doctor who chose to save rather than let die. Change any single variable and he dies. If he's conscious when he hits, he dies. Tense muscles, rigid body, catastrophic impact. If he hits concrete instead of glass, he dies. Instant deceleration, force too great to survive. If the glass were solid instead of individual panes, he dies. No sequential energy absorption. If his body lands in any position other than draped across the girders, he dies. Concentrated force, broken spine, shattered skull. If that German surgeon chooses amputation instead of reconstruction, Magee lives, but loses his arm, loses his ability to work in aviation, loses the life he rebuilt. Every variable mattered. Every factor was critical. Remove any single element, and the outcome changes from miraculous survival to inevitable death. 1 in 55 million. But odds are just numbers. They describe what should happen, not what did happen. What did happen is this. One man fell for the narrowest possible window between death and life, and he lived for 61 more years. 61 years of marriage, of children, of grandchildren, of Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings and ordinary forgettable days are the substance of a life. 61 years he earned his pilot's license and flew again, choosing courage over fear. 61 years he worked in an industry that had nearly killed him, transforming trauma into purpose. 61 years he carried the guilt of surviving, when 7 friends didn't, a burden he never fully released. 61 years of borrowed time. Today, the St. Nazaire train station still stands. Rebuilt, modernized, the glass roof replaced with contemporary materials. Thousands of travelers pass through it every day, rushing to catch trains, checking their phones, drinking coffee, living their ordinary lives. Most of them never know what happened there. never know that the ceiling above them was once the difference between death and survival for one American airman. A small plaque on the wall tells a story. But plaques don't convey the terror of falling, the pain of impact, the impossibility of survival, the weight of living when others died. Right now, somewhere in the sky, commercial aircraft are flying at 22,000 feet. Passengers sit comfortably in pressurized cabins. They watch movies. They sleep. They look down at the earth 4 miles below and never think about how fragile the membrane is between safety and catastrophe. But Alan Magee knew. He knew what it meant to fall, to understand with absolute certainty that you are about to die, and then impossibly to survive. He knew that survival isn't always about strength or skill or deserving. Sometimes it's about being in the right place at the wrong time. Sometimes it's about glass breaking in sequence instead of all at once. Sometimes it's about an enemy doctor who remembered his Hippocratic oath. He knew that the margin between life and death is thinner than we want to believe, that we live our entire lives on knife's edge, separated from oblivion by nothing more than luck, circumstance, and the arbitrary mercy of physics. And he knew, perhaps better than anyone who's ever lived, that borrowed time is still time, that 61 years that shouldn't have happened is still 61 years of sunrises, embraces, laughter, tears, work, rest, and all the mundane, beautiful moments that make up a human life. The universe doesn't owe us miracles. It doesn't promise fairness. It doesn't guarantee that good people survive and bad people perish. It operates according to laws, gravity, momentum, force, energy, that are utterly indifferent to our hopes, our fears, our worthiness. But sometimes, just sometimes, those laws bend. Not break, just bend, just enough. Sometimes glass shatters in sequence instead of as a whole. Sometimes your unconscious body lands in the one position that distributes force instead of concentrating it. Sometimes an enemy chooses to heal instead of harm. Sometimes the 1 in 55 million chance comes through, and when it does, you get 61 more years. You get to fall in love. You get to have children. You get to choose, consciously, deliberately, courageously, to return to the sky that tried to kill you, not as a victim, but as a pilot, not running from trauma, but transforming it into purpose. You get to plant a tree in France and call it the Tree of Peace. You get to stand at the graves of your crewmates and say the words that need saying, even if they don't erase the guilt. You get to live long enough to become a grandfather, to retire, to grow old, to die of natural causes in a hospital bed surrounded by family, instead of as a red stain on a French street in 1943. You get to die on your own terms, not gravity's terms. Alan Magee fell 22,000 feet without a parachute on January 3rd, 1943. And the glass that saved him teaches us something profound. Sometimes breaking is how we survive. The glass didn't stay intact. That would have killed him. It broke. But it broke in a way that absorbed energy, that distributed force, that transformed a fatal impact into a survivable one. And maybe that's the real lesson. Not that we should be unbreakable, but that we should break in ways that let us survive, that we should bend before we shatter, that we should allow ourselves to be transformed by trauma instead of destroyed by it. Alan Magee broke that day. His body broke. His mind broke. His sense of safety and certainty broke. But he broke in a way that allowed him to be reassembled, to heal, to continue, to live. And for 61 more years, he carried the scars, physical and psychological, of that breaking. But he also carried the gift, the impossible, undeserved, miraculous gift of survival. Rest in peace, Alan Eugene Magee. January 13th, 1919, December 20th, 2003. And to the 7 men who fell that day and never rose again, we remember your names. We honor your sacrifice. You were not forgotten.